The room was still, heavy with the kind of silence that only hangs in a courtroom when the stakes are too high for nervous chatter. Every pen was poised, every eye fixed on the exchange unfolding. Jasmine Crockett had just finished her point, steady in tone, precise in delivery. And then, without warning, Judge Stephen Breyer tilted his head back and let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't polite. It wasn't kind. It was the kind of laugh that cuts across the room like a blade, leaving a mark on everyone who hears. It gasps, rippled through the chamber. The suddenness of it startled even the most seasoned observers, men and women who had witnessed decades of courtroom drama. The laugh seemed to mock, to belittle, to say without words that Crockett's presence, her argument, her very being, was amusing. Cameras zoomed in, catching the smirk that lingered on Breyer's face, the dismissive gleam in his eyes. Crockett did not flinch. For a second, she was perfectly still, her eyes fixed on him. The silence that followed the laughter felt longer than it was, stretching thin over the heads of everyone in attendance. Viewers watching from home felt it too, leaning closer to their screens as if the air had gone colder. Reporters scribbled furiously, already sensing that something extraordinary was happening. What was it about that laugh? It wasn't just sound, it was power wielded carelessly. To some, it was an attempt to reduce a woman's argument to a joke. To others, it was the echo of generations of dismissal, the old guard brushing aside new voices that dared to demand space. And in that moment, the country seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Crockett's response. Her expression never broke. No anger, no visible sting, only a calm that was sharper than any outburst could have been. It was the calm of someone who knew she was being tested, someone who had walked into rooms like this before and had been underestimated every single time. The courtroom leaned forward, restless and tense. The smirk remained on Breyer's lips, but already there was unease in the air, a sense that the laugh had unleashed something he could not control. And then Crockett inhaled, ready to speak again. But Crockett's next line would flip the entire courtroom upside down. What unfolded in that chamber was never just about a laugh. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a routine exchange, a fleeting moment in a long hearing. But beneath the surface, this confrontation carried the weight of something much larger. The courtroom was not merely a place of law. That Diet became a mirror for America itself, reflecting the battle lines of race, respect, and justice that have shaped the nation's history. For weeks, anticipation had been building. Lines framed the upcoming session as one to watch. Commentators speculated on whether Jasmine Crockett, a rising force with a reputation for cutting clarity, would be able to hold her own before one of the most seasoned jurists in modern history. On talk shows and podcasts, voices rose and clashed over what this meant for the balance of respect between new leadership and entrenched authority. Social media hummed with hashtags predicting a showdown, supporters of Crockett posting clips of her fiery past speeches, while skeptics dismissed her as out of her depth by the time she walked into that chamber. Millions were already watching not just the cameras in the room, but the countless eyes waiting behind screens across the country. For young people, for immigrants, for communities that had too often been told their voices did not matter, Crockett was walking in as more than an individual. She was walking in as a symbol. Judge Breyer, for his part, embodied the old guard. His decades of rulings and sharp wit had made him a respected, even untouchable figure in legal circles. To many, he represented continuity, the steady hand of tradition. But to others, he symbolized something colder. The voice of institutions that had laughed off calls for equity, that had dismissed the urgency of change with a smile and a shrug. His laugh in that moment, then, was not just his own. It carried the weight of an era. That is why the stakes were so high. Because this was not just to people trading words, it was to America's colliding in front of the nation's eyes. One America that had grown comfortable in its power, quick to dismiss those it deemed unworthy, and another America determined, resilient, demanding to be heard. Inside the courtroom, the tension was electric. Every glance, every whisper carried significance. The journalists in the back row knew they were witnessing something that would echo long beyond the walls of that chamber. They sensed a moment that would be replayed, dissected, and argued over on every platform. And as Breyer's laugh lingered in the air, they braced themselves for Crockett's response. The viewers at home leaned in too. To them, it was not about case law or judicial procedure. It was about whether someone who looked like them, who spoke like them, who carried the same scars of dismissal, could finally seize the upper hand in a place that had so often denied them dignity. And that is why the silence after the laugh was so deafening. Because everyone knew what was coming next had the power to shatter expectations. This was no longer routine. This was no longer predictable. This was about to become history. Viewers who thought this was just another routine, hearing had no idea history was about to be made. To understand the weight of that laugh, one must understand the man behind it.
Ow.
Judge Stephen Breyer was no ordinary figure in American law. For decades, he had sat at the pinnacle of judicial authority. His name etched into countless opinions, his voice shaping the very fabric of legal precedent. His reputation preceded him brilliant, witty, sharp with language, and at times, disarmingly charming. But beneath that polished surface lay a reputation that was more complicated, a man so confident in his intellect, so comfortable in his role, that he often dismissed challenges with the flick of a smile or the sting of a quip. Those who studied Breyer's career saw two patterns. On one side, there was the jurist who championed reason, who dissected complex issues with surgical precision. On the other, there was the Breyer who wielded humor like a weapon, who could disarm or belittle opponents with a well-timed chuckle. In the hallowed halls of justice, where every word carried weight, his laugh was never just noise. It was a declaration. It said, "I've seen more, I know more, I am more." And for years, that posture had gone unchecked. Colleagues often described him as a man who never doubted his place at the table. When junior attorneys presented arguments, Breyer would sometimes lean back, smirk, and interrupt with questions that cut not to the heart of the case, but to the fragility of the speakers. Confidence. Some saw this as mentorship cloaked in challenge. Others saw it as condescension, a method of reminding everyone who held the real authority. That laugh, then, was not born in isolation. It was the product of decades of being the unquestioned voice in the room. It was the sound of power, habituated to its own echo. Breyer's defenders argued he had earned that authority, that his intellect was unmatched, service to the country beyond question. But his critics pointed to the shadow side of brilliance, arrogance, and in the eyes of many who had watched him over the years, arrogance was the one trait he never tried to hide. For a long time, the nation had indulged him. A laugh from Breyer was reported as wit, a flash of levity in the weighty world of law. Commentators chuckled along. Media outlets quoted his quips as if they were pearls of wisdom. But times were changing. America was changing. And where once a laugh was accepted as harmless, now it was being re-examined as a relic of a culture, too, comfortable with dismissing new voices. This was the Breyer who entered the chamber that day. He was not simply a man reacting in the moment. He was the embodiment of an institution. His laugh was centuries of entrenched authority made audible, the sound of gatekeepers who had long controlled, who was taken seriously and who was not. It was the sound women and minorities had heard in countless boardrooms, classrooms, and courtrooms. "You don't belong here. Your words are amusing, not threatening. Sit down." And so when Breyer laughed at Jasmine Crockett, it was never just about him. It was about history repeating itself in real time. His reputation for quick wit suddenly became something darker, a symbol of dismissal aimed at someone who represented everything his generation had overlooked. Yet there was irony in that moment too, because while Breyer had always used humor as a shield and a sword, that very laugh would become the crack in his armor. It revealed a complacency, a belief that no one could challenge him effectively. It exposed a blind spot, one that Jasmine Crockett was uniquely prepared to exploit. Observers who knew Breyer well recognized the pattern. He underestimated challengers because underestimation had always been safe for him. But this time that instinct betrayed him. The smirk that followed, the subtle shake of his head, The air of superiority, all of it, played into Crockett's hands, setting the stage for a reversal that would be replayed across the nation. In that moment, Breyer stood not just as a man, but as a symbol of everything Crockett, the millions who identified with her, had been fighting against: dismissal, belittlement, the smug certainty of an establishment unwilling to change. The laugh carried echoes of past dismissals, past mockeries, past attempts to erase dignity with a sound. And it was about to backfire in a way that would redefine the encounter. The smirk lingered. The courtroom bristled. The old guard thought it had won a small victory in a single laugh. But what Breyer did not realize was that this laugh would not end the conversation. It would ignite it. And as the tension coiled tighter, one truth became clear. The stage was no longer his. The courtroom was shifting, tilting toward the woman who had been underestimated for the last time. What came next would not only silence that laugh, it would echo far beyond the walls of the chamber. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in that chamber by accident, nor by privilege. Her story was not the product of a gilded path, but of grit, persistence, and the unshakable belief that her voice mattered even when others tried to tell her it did not. To understand the stillness in her face when Breyer laughed, to grasp why she did not flinch or falter, one must trace the long road that had prepared her for moments exactly like this. Born in Texas, Crockett grew up in a world where resilience wasn't optional, it was survival. She was raised in a community that knew both hardship and pride, where neighbors leaned on each other when institutions looked away. From an early age, she saw the contrasts that defined America: wealth and neglect, opportunity and exclusion, justice promised but often denied. Her own life became a study in those contrasts. She worked for every inch of ground she stood on, navigating a society that too often dismissed women of color as afterthoughts. Law was not just a profession. She stumbled into what was a calling, shaped by lived experience. Before she ever stepped into Congress, before she became a rising star in national politics, she was an attorney fighting for those without a voice. Her clients were not celebrities or titans of industry. They were families staring down eviction notices, young people trapped in a justice system stacked against them, immigrants facing the crushing weight of bureaucracy. Each case was a reminder of the imbalance of power, of how easy it was for the system to laugh at those who had no defense. Those early battles etched something into her, a composure forged in fire. In courtrooms across Texas, she learned the value of calm in the face of arrogance. Judges underestimated her. Opposing counsel mocked her. There were moments when laughter, derision, and dismissal felt like daily companions. Each time, she stayed, she fought. She won more than they expected. And with every victory, she carried her community's pride onto bigger stages. Her journey into politics was an extension of that fight. Crockett saw lawmaking as the broader courtroom, the place where the lives of millions could be defended or dismantled with the stroke of a pen. She entered Congress not as someone seeking status, but as someone carrying stories, names, and struggles on her shoulders. Every insult hurled at her, every condescending laugh, was less about her personally and more about the people she represented. And that was precisely why she never allowed such moments to shake her. By the time she faced Breyer, Crockett had already built a reputation for fearlessness. While clips of her sharp interrogations and no-nonsense speeches had gone viral before, young women across the country looked at her and saw possibility, proof that you could be unapologetically bold, sharp, and authentic in spaces that were not designed for you. She wasn't polished for their comfort. She was precise for her people. It was this background that gave weight to her silence after Breyer laughed. Others might have lashed out. Others might have faltered. But Crockett had been here before, dismissed in classrooms, underestimated in courtrooms, doubted in Congress. Her calm was not passivity. It was power. It was the knowledge that her strength did not depend on matching arrogance with outrage, but on letting dignity do the work arrogance could never withstand. And so, as Breyer's laugh faded into uneasy silence, Crockett's story hung invisibly in the air. It was in the way she stood, shoulders firm. It was in the way her eyes did not dart or tremble. She was not merely responding to a man's laughter. She was responding to centuries of laughter aimed at people like her. Every ancestor who had been mocked for daring to speak, every immigrant dismissed for their accent, every woman told to stay quiet, she carried all of them into that pause. The irony was sharp. The very experiences meant to diminish her had become her arsenal. The struggles, the scars, the countless moments of dismissal had prepared her for this confrontation. While Breyer relied on habit, on decades of unchallenged authority, Crockett drew strength from every battle she had already survived. His laugh was designed to shrink her, but it only reminded her of how far she had come. That is why, in that frozen second, Crockett's presence radiated beyond herself. The people watching at home saw more than a politician. They saw someone who had walked their road, someone whose victories were hard-earned, someone who refused to bow even in the face of power. For them, her silence was not weakness. It was a promise. A promise that she was about to answer that laugh in a way none of them would forget. And so the chamber waited, and the nation waited. Breyer's smirk remained, but for the first time in years, the certainty behind it began to flicker. He had underestimated her, as so many had before. But Crockett's entire life had been preparation for this. The weight of her journey pressed into the air, heavier with each passing second of silence. And when she finally opened her mouth to speak again, it was not just her voice that would be heard, it was the voice of everyone who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or laughed at. And those very struggles would soon become the ammunition she unleashed. The sound of Breyer's laugh still lingered like smoke in the chamber, its echo hanging in the rafters long after his lips had closed. But if he expected Jasmine Crockett to shrink beneath it, he was mistaken. She leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on him, her expression carved in stone. The courtroom braced itself, knowing the next exchange would set the tone for everything. To follow, Breyer cleared his throat, feigning composure. "Congresswoman," he said, voice laced with amusement, "your interpretation, while colorful, is hardly the kind of rigorous analysis this court relies upon. Surely you don't believe your remarks rise to the level of constitutional significance?" His words dripped with condescension, each syllable carefully designed to belittle without appearing overtly cruel. It was the kind of polished dismissal that had silenced countless others before. But Crockett did not take the bait. She let the words land, allowed the pause to stretch, and then replied in a voice that was calm but unyielding. "What I believe, Your Honor, is that dignity does not depend on whether it is convenient for the powerful. And what I know from the communities I serve is that constitutional significance is not measured by who laughs the loudest." A murmur swept through the chamber. Pens froze above notepads. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer, their lenses capturing every flicker of Breyer's face as his smirk faltered for the briefest moment. The balance in the room was shifting, the laughter that once dominated now sounding hollow against the clarity of her words. Breyer pressed back, his tone sharper this time. "Dignity, Congresswoman, is a fine sentiment. But this court is not moved by sentiment. We are guided by law, by precedent, by logic, not by speeches designed for television audiences." His jab was pointed, dismissing her as a politician, seeking sound bites, an outsider trying to play in an arena she did not belong. Crockett's reply came without hesitation. "And yet, Your Honor, the law you speak of has never existed in a vacuum. Every precedent you cherish was born of a moment when someone refused to accept dismissal, when someone's so-called sentiment demanded recognition. The very Constitution you guard so closely was once considered an impossible dream." Gasps broke through the silence. A low rumble of approval rippled across the gallery, quickly shushed by the bailiff. Breyer's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. What had begun as amusement was now shifting toward irritation. The confidence behind his laugh was slipping, piece by piece, replaced by the realization that Crockett was not playing his game, she was rewriting it. The tension between them tightened with every exchange. He leaned in, his voice rising with controlled impatience. "Congresswoman, I would advise you to remember where you stand. This chamber is not a place for political theater." She didn't blink. And I would remind you, Your Honor, that theater only exists when truth is treated as performance. If telling the truth in this chamber feels like theater, perhaps it's because the audience has grown too comfortable with fiction. The words landed like a hammer. The gallery erupted in an audible stir, gasps mixing with murmurs that filled the air. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances. The contrast was undeniable. Breyer, the emblem of dismissive authority, clinging to control through tone and tradition. Crockett, unflinching, wielding calm like a blade sharper than any outburst could ever be. In that instant, the clash stopped. Being about two individuals became about two worlds colliding, the entrenched certainty of old power against the rising demand for dignity, representation, and justice. And the energy in the room told everyone watching that the balance was tipping. Breyer adjusted his glasses, shifting in his seat as though to reclaim authority. But the silence that followed was no longer his ally. It belonged to her. The laughter echoed, but the silence after was even louder. The silence stretched, taut and trembling, as though the very walls of the chamber were holding their breath. Breyer's smirk still lingered, but the edges of it had begun to fray. His eyes flicked briefly to the gallery, then back to Jasmine Crockett, as if to remind her and everyone watching who still held the seat of power. But Crockett did not avert her gaze. She straightened, hands resting calmly on the table, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried like steel wrapped in velvet. "Your Honor," she began, the words deliberate, unhurried, "when you laugh. You may think it is harmless. You may think it is only a moment of levity, a passing gesture. But for those of us who have been laughed at our entire lives, it is something else entirely. It is a reminder of every door slammed shut. Every hand waved dismissively, every time we were told our voices did not matter. That laugh is not new. It is centuries old. And yet here I stand, unshaken." The room froze. The smirk on Breyer's face flickered, the self-assured curve of his lips tightening ever so slightly. He shifted in his chair, though he tried to mask it with another arch of his brow. But Crockett was not finished. Her words rolled slowly like thunder building in the distance. "Do you know what happens when you laugh at people like me, Judge? We get stronger. We get sharper. We learn how to stand taller, how to carry not just our own dignity, but the dignity of those who came before us. That laugh you offered me today is the same one my grandmother heard when she was told she would never amount to anything. It is the same one my father heard when he applied for jobs he was never called back for. It is the same one young children hear right now in classrooms where their intelligence is underestimated because of their names or the color of their skin. And I am here today to tell you that we will not be laughed away." Murmur swept through the gallery, breaking the stillness like glass. Journalists' pens scratched furiously across their notepads. Cameras zoomed tighter on her face, capturing the glint in her eyes. The hush was no longer a void, it was a current carrying her words deeper into every corner of the room. Breyer's smirk faltered further. He adjusted his glasses, leaned back, then forward again, as if unsure which posture could shield him from the weight of what was being said. But Crockett's tone only grew steadier. "You call it sentiment, Judge. You dismiss it as theater. But let me remind you, sentiment is what gave birth to your Constitution. Sentiment is what carried enslaved people through chains, what marched women to the ballot box, what pulled immigrants across oceans with nothing but hope in their pockets. If the law is empty of sentiment, then it is nothing but ink on paper. It is sentiment that makes law worth defending." Gasps erupted, scattered and sharp, from corners of the courtroom. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned forward as though not to miss a single word. Breyer's hand twitched toward his gavel, but he stopped himself, aware that striking it now would only underscore her dominance. His silence was louder than any ruling he could issue. Crockett pressed on, her voice unwavering. "You say I am here for television? But, Your Honor, people watching at home, the people who have been told their lives are insignificant, deserve to see that even in this chamber, they are not invisible. They deserve to see that their truth can be spoken in halls where laughter has long been reserved for the powerful. If that is theater, then so be it. But know this, sometimes theater tells more truth than the court itself. The room erupted again, this time louder gasps, murmurs, the shuffle of restless bodies. A young reporter in the second row nearly dropped his pen, eyes wide, mouth slightly agape. Beside him, a veteran columnist simply nodded, as if acknowledging that a new chapter in political history had just been written before their eyes. Breyer's smirk was gone now. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed thin. He tried to maintain the facade of composure, but the flush creeping into his cheeks betrayed him. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he had been disarmed not by another jurist of equal standing, but by a congresswoman whose strength came not from institutional weight, but from lived truth. Crockett let the silence return once more, let it do the work of carrying her words deeper. And then, with the precision of someone delivering a verdict, she struck again. Your laugh was meant to shrink me. Instead, it has only proven my point. Too many in power still believe mockery is stronger than justice, still believe arrogance is stronger than dignity. But let me tell you this. Justice does not bow to laughter. Dignity does not bow to arrogance. And I do not bow to you. The chamber was electric now, a live wire humming with disbelief and awe. Some in the gallery clasped their hands over their mouths, others whispered frantically to neighbors. The court reporters could barely keep pace, their keyboards clacking. Like rapid gunfire as they tried to capture every syllable, Breyer sat still, no longer leaning back, no longer smirking. His eyes narrowed, but there was no wit left to summon, no chuckle to deflect the blow. His silence was the clearest admission yet. Crockett had landed her strike, and yet she wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just enough to draw the room closer. You may sit on the bench, but do not mistake your seat. For supremacy, the bench is not higher than the truth. And the truth, Your Honor, is that the people you laugh at will outlast the laughter. They will inherit the justice you think you own. And they will sit where you sit, not because you allowed it, but because they claimed it. The words cracked through the room like a lightning strike. The hush that followed was absolute. No coughs, no shuffles, only the raw stillness of an audience stunned into silence. Breyer's expression was carved in stone now, the smirk long gone, replaced with something far less certain. The moment had shifted irrevocably. Crockett was no longer just responding to a laugh. She was rewriting the narrative of who had the power to define dignity in that room. And just when it seemed she had landed the final blow, Crockett revealed a deeper truth no one saw coming. The gavel finally fell, signaling the close of the hearing. But the echoes of Crockett's words were already racing far beyond the courtroom. Within minutes, clips of the exchange hit social media, clipped and reshared by journalists, activists, and ordinary viewers alike. The hashtags lit up instantly. #Crockett clap back, #dignity over mockery, and simply #the laugh. What had begun as a smirk and a moment of derision was now ricocheting across millions of screens. On TikTok, teenagers stitched the clip with their own reactions, mouths wide open, gasping, replaying the line, "Justice does not bow to laughter. Dignity does not bow to arrogance." The words were set to music, looped over beats, turned into short edits where Crockett's defiant stare became an anthem of resilience. Twitter, or X, as it was now called, turned into a battlefield. Supporters hailed her as a truth-teller, who had dragged centuries of condescension into the light. Critics scrambled, some insisting she had disrespected the bench, others dismissing her as performative. But the balance of perception was already tipping. Cable news picked up the footage almost immediately. One anchor leaned forward in awe. You could hear the air change in that room. It wasn't just a response. It was a rebuke etched in history. Another network tried to temper the hype, calling it a heated exchange. But even as they downplayed their own beer roll, replayed her icy words again and again. By the second replay, the impact was undeniable. Memes flooded Instagram. One showed Breyer's fading smirk under the caption, "When you realize the laugh won't save you." Another overlaid Crockett's words on a burning gavel, a symbol of the old guard's authority cracking under pressure. The virality wasn't just noise, it was cultural resonance. She had become the focal point of a conversation about respect, dignity, In Power in America, supporters organized online digital rallies, flooding comment sections with affirmations. She spoke for all of us. That laugh ends with our generation, Crockett 2028. The sheer enthusiasm painted her. Less as a politician caught in a spat, and more as a figure who carried the voices of those who felt dismissed for too long. Meanwhile, her critics stumbled. Some tried to clip her words out of context, presenting them as an attack on the institution of justice itself. But their edits rang hollow when viewers could simply click on the full video and see the arc of her calmness against Breyer's smirk. Others accused her of theatrics, but the more they said performance, the more her supporters embraced the metaphor, arguing that sometimes truth had to be performed to pierce through centuries of denial. By evening, YouTube compilations had surfaced top 10 political mic drops of the decade. Crockett's line sat at number 1 barely hours after it happened. Reaction channels lit up with commentary, their thumbnails screaming shock and awe, while late-night comedians prepped monologues praising her courage. But beyond the memes and clips, a deeper shift was taking root. Civil rights groups, immigrant organizations, and grassroots coalitions began issuing statements of solidarity. Crockett reminded America Today, one wrote, that dignity is not granted from the bench, it is claimed by the people. Another activist framed it more starkly: for every grandmother who was laughed at in a bank, for every worker dismissed in a meeting, for every student mocked in a classroom, this was their voice finally echoing in power. The momentum was undeniable. What had started as a courtroom exchange was now bleeding into the national conversation about who gets to speak and who gets silenced. Crockett's name trended alongside historical figures, as though viewers instinctively recognized her moment as part of a larger tapestry of defiance against mockery and arrogance. In living rooms across the country, families replayed the clip. On their TVs, some cried quietly at the recognition. Others nodded in approval. A grandmother in Chicago told her granddaughter, "That's the sound of not letting them laugh you away." In Los Angeles, college students gathered in dorm lounges to watch reaction videos. Each punch of her words met with collective gasps. In Houston, a group of activists planned a watch party replaying the full exchange, promising to carry her message into their next rally. The establishment felt the tremors too. Strategists whispered about how this moment could elevate Crockett's national profile, turning her into not just a representative, but a symbol. Conservative pundits fretted over how easily she had transformed a courtroom laugh into a cultural reckoning. Progressive leaders, meanwhile, quietly celebrated, recognizing that dignity, once mocked, had now become the headline. By nightfall, one truth was clear: the courtroom had not contained Crockett's words. They had spilled out, reshaping the conversation, rattling the hierarchy of respect itself. What many thought would be a routine hearing had become a flashpoint. And somewhere, mid the storm of hashtags and headlines, one refrain rose above the rest. Jasmine Crockett had not just answered a laugh, she had turned it into a movement. What had begun as a laugh, a dismissive gesture meant to reduce her to an afterthought, ended as something entirely different. Jasmine Crockett stood in that chamber not as a lone figure sparring with a judge, but as a vessel for millions of unheard voices. Her words did not simply settle the dispute. They lifted the moment into a truth that could not be laughed away. She drew in a breath, steady and measured, and spoke with a cadence that turned the room into a sanctuary of meaning. Respect, she said, is not a gift handed down by the powerful. It is the foundation on which justice stands. Without it, there is no fairness, no equality, no America worth believing in. The chamber fell still. Breyer, who had once worn his smirk like armor, now leaned forward, his face tight, his laughter silenced. In that instant, the power dynamic had shifted completely. Crockett was no longer responding to him. She was speaking beyond him, her voice rising into something larger. "You can laugh at me," she continued, her eyes steady. "But when you do, you laugh at the very people I represent. And let me be clear, America is watching. They are tired of being dismissed. They are tired of their dignity being mocked. They will not be silent any longer." Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they had just captured the line that would headline broadcasts across the country. Some in the audience nodded subtly. Others sat in stunned silence. What everyone recognized, though, is that Crockett had elevated the exchange into something untouchable. She did not stop there. This is bigger than you or me. It is about a nation that has too often confused arrogance with authority and silence with strength. But true strength is not in mocking the vulnerable. True strength is in honoring the dignity of every human being who walks into this room. Her words did not sound rehearsed, they sounded lived. They carried the weight of generations who had endured the laugh, the smirk, the shrug of dismissal. They carried the pride of families who had fought to be recognized, to be respected, to be counted. Breyer's silence was deafening. For once, the judge had no clever retort, no witty aside. He sat in the echo of her truth, knowing that the world outside those walls was already resonating with her message. And then came the crescendo, the line that seemed to pierce the air itself. Dignity always silences arrogance. The words landed like a gavel, striking not just at the end of an argument, but at the heart of a national truth. The crowd in the chamber did not erupt in applause that would have broken the gravity of the moment. But the stillness was its own kind of ovation. Cameras zoomed in, capturing her calm face, the very picture of resolve. For those watching at home, the meaning was unmistakable. Crockett had not only defended herself, she had defended every immigrant child told they didn't belong, every working-class family dismissed by the elite, every marginalized community laughed at by those in power. In that moment, she became more than a politician. She became a symbol, and that is what transformed the confrontation into history. It was no longer just about a judge and a congresswoman. It was about America's unfinished story of respect. Injustice, told through the defiance of a woman who refused to let arrogance have the last word. The moral was clear. Arrogance can mock, it can belittle, it can even laugh, but it cannot endure. Dignity, once spoken with conviction, drowns out the noise and lingers long after the laughter dies. The silence in that chamber was not empty. It was filled with a message the nation would carry forward, that dignity is not negotiable. Justice will always belong to those who refuse to bow their heads. And with those words, Crockett left the courtroom not only as the victor of an exchange, but as the voice of something far greater, a voice reminding America of its promise. Because in the end, dignity always silences arrogance. The courtroom lights dimmed in memory, but the echoes of that exchange continued to reverberate far beyond those walls. What viewers had witnessed was not a fleeting political spat. It was a lesson carved into the fabric of the moment. When arrogance tries to laugh away dignity, dignity always wins. Across the country, families replayed the clip, drawing strength from Crockett's composure. Teachers showed it in classrooms as proof that respect is not requested, is commanded by truth. Activists shared it at rallies, reminding their communities that no sneer, no smirk, no dismissive chuckle can diminish their worth. But the story doesn't end here. Every viewer who felt the sting of that laugh, every person who has ever been dismissed, underestimated, or mocked, carries a piece of this story forward. The fight for justice, for equality, for respect, is not fought in grand speeches alone. It is fought in every conversation where you refuse to shrink, in every moment where you answer arrogance with calm strength. So take this moment with you. Share it, discuss it, let it remind you of the power that comes when truth meets courage. And when the world tries to laugh you off the stage, remember Crockett's words and stand taller, because history is not written by the loudest laugh. It is written by those who never stop demanding dignity. If you felt the power of this moment, make sure you don't just watch, be part of the movement. Subscribe, share, and keep the conversation alive. Together, we ensure that arrogance never has the last word. And let the lesson echo one more time. Dignity always silences arrogance.